Look at a map of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and your eyes are naturally drawn toward the country's vast center, a sea of green rainforests stretching across one of Africa's largest nations. But the place that has become one of the world's most strategically important battlegrounds lies much farther east. Near the borders with Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi in and around North and South Kivu, violence has repeatedly erupted, displacing millions of civilians and destabilizing an already fragile region. At first glance, these clashes appear to be another tragic chapter in a long history of regional conflict. Yet beneath the forests, mountains, and red earth lies a reality that connects this corner of Central Africa to factories in China, electric vehicle showrooms in Europe, technology companies in the United States, and consumers almost everywhere on Earth, because hidden beneath Congolese soil is one of the world's most valuable strategic resources. Cobalt. It is a metal that few people ever think about. You can't easily see it inside a smartphone. It doesn't receive the same headlines as oil or natural gas. Most people couldn't identify it in a photograph. Yet for years, cobalt has been one of the essential ingredients in many lithium-ion batteries, helping improve energy density and thermal stability. Those batteries power laptops, smartphones, power tools, electric vehicles, and large-scale energy storage systems that support renewable electricity grids. The global transition toward cleaner energy has dramatically increased the strategic importance of securing reliable supplies of critical minerals. And when it comes to cobalt, one country towers above every other producer. The Democratic Republic of the Congo accounts for roughly 70 to 75% of the world's mined cobalt production. Pause for a moment and consider what that means. Imagine if one country produced nearly 3/4 of the world's oil during the 20th century, or if nearly every semiconductor on Earth depended on minerals found inside a single national border. Governments would compete for influence, companies would race to secure contracts, investors would watch every political development, supply disruptions would ripple across global markets. That is increasingly the reality surrounding Congo's cobalt. Every electric vehicle manufacturer planning the next generation of batteries, every battery company negotiating long-term supply agreements, every government trying to reduce dependence on vulnerable supply chains, every technology firm designing products for the coming decade. Whether they realize it or not, they are connected to decisions made thousands of miles away in mining regions most consumers will never visit. And that is where the contradiction begins. Around the world, political leaders describe the clean energy transition as the pathway toward a more sustainable future. Electric vehicles promise lower emissions. Renewable energy promises cleaner electricity. Battery technology is presented as one of the foundations of 21st century industrial development. Yet one of the most important building blocks of that transition often originates in regions struggling with insecurity, weak governance, humanitarian crises, and armed violence. The cleaner the world's ambitions become, the more attention turns toward places that remain politically fragile. This isn't because cobalt automatically causes conflict, nor is every mining region in Congo an active battlefield. Much of the country's industrial cobalt production comes from southeastern provinces like Lualaba and Haut-Katanga, where enormous copper and cobalt deposits form part of the famous Central African Copper Belt. Large industrial mines operate there, alongside smaller artisanal operations. But instability elsewhere in the country, including persistent fighting across eastern Congo, has shaped international perceptions of the Congolese state as a whole, while highlighting the broader governance challenges facing one of the world's most resource-rich nations. It raises an uncomfortable question. How can a country blessed with extraordinary mineral wealth remain among the least economically developed places on Earth? The simplest answer is often the wrong one. Many observers reduce Congo's story to corruption. Others explain everything through ethnic tensions or weak political institutions. Those factors certainly matter. Governance challenges are real, local grievances are real, regional rivalries are real, but treating them as the entire explanation misses the larger system surrounding them. Because Congo's story has rarely been shaped by domestic politics alone. Again and again, over more than a century, the country's immense natural wealth has attracted outside powers, foreign companies, neighboring governments, and international investors. The particular resource changes with each era, but the underlying pattern remains remarkably consistent. Once it was rubber, then copper, then uranium, now cobalt. The names change, the technologies change, the geopolitical competition changes, but the strategic importance of Congo's resources continues to reshape both international interests and domestic realities. To understand why, we need to stop thinking about minerals as simple commodities. In the modern world, certain resources become strategic because they enable entire industries. Oil fueled the age of automobiles and aviation. Rare earth elements became crucial for advanced electronics. Semiconductors became essential for computing and artificial intelligence. Today, critical minerals increasingly occupy that same category. They are not merely raw materials, they are industrial foundations. Without reliable access to them, factories slow down. Supply chains become vulnerable, prices become volatile. Governments begin worrying not only about economic competitiveness, but also about national security. This is why policymakers now speak about critical minerals with the same seriousness once reserved for energy security. Control over these resources increasingly translates into industrial power. Industrial power shapes economic influence. Economic influence shapes geopolitical leverage. That chain of logic has transformed places once considered peripheral into strategic centers of global competition. Congo sits at the heart of that transformation. Yet extracting minerals from the ground is only the beginning of a much longer journey. Ore leaves a mine. It must be transported across difficult terrain, processed, refined, converted into specialized chemicals, manufactured into battery components, assembled into battery cells, integrated into vehicles or electronic devices. Each step creates additional value, each step represents another layer of industrial capability, and each step becomes another arena where countries compete for technological leadership. The result is that Congo's cobalt is no longer simply about mining. It is about who controls supply chains, who dominates advanced manufacturing, who secures future industries, and who shapes the economic architecture of the clean energy era. Suddenly, a remote mining concession is connected to global industrial policy. A contract signed in Central Africa influences investment decisions in Asia. A disruption in Congolese production affects battery manufacturers across multiple continents. The map begins to look very different. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is no longer just another country facing difficult development challenges. It becomes a strategic crossroads where multinational corporations negotiate billion-dollar investments, neighboring states pursue regional interests, global powers compete over industrial resilience, and consumers unknowingly participate every time they buy a new phone or electric vehicle. This is not simply the story of an African nation struggling with instability, it is the story of how the modern global economy repeatedly converges on places where indispensable resources are found. And to understand why cobalt has become both a blessing and a burden, we first have to understand how Congo's extraordinary geography, and the history built upon it, turned one of the richest pieces of land on Earth into one of the world's most contested strategic landscapes. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is often described as a geological miracle. Spread across an area larger than Western Europe, the country possesses extraordinary deposits of copper, cobalt, gold, coltan, tin, diamonds, lithium, and dozens of other commercially valuable minerals. Beneath its forests, rivers, and savannas lies one of the richest concentrations of natural resources ever discovered within a single national border. On paper, this should have made Congo one of Africa's greatest economic success stories. Instead, it became one of history's greatest paradoxes. To understand why, we first have to separate wealth from prosperity. Natural resources create opportunity. They do not automatically create functioning institutions, stable governments, or diversified economies. In fact, history repeatedly shows that extraordinary resource wealth can attract intense external competition long before a nation develops the political capacity to manage it. And nowhere illustrates that contradiction more clearly than Congo. The country's southeastern provinces, particularly Lualaba and Haut-Katanga, sit atop the Central African Copper Belt, one of the richest copper and cobalt formations on Earth. These deposits stretch across the border into Zambia, creating a geological region that has supplied global industry for generations. Today, this same region produces the overwhelming majority of the world's mined cobalt. But extracting cobalt from the ground is only the first step. Roads must reach remote mines. Railways must transport ore hundreds of kilometers. Electricity must power processing facilities. Workers need training. Governments must regulate contracts. Companies require legal certainty before investing billions of dollars. Each missing piece reduces how much value a country ultimately captures from its own resources. And this is where geography becomes more complicated than simply having minerals underground. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is enormous. Its territory spans rainforests, mountains, rivers, and isolated mining districts separated by vast distances. Building national infrastructure across such terrain is extraordinarily expensive. Many mining areas developed connections designed to export raw materials toward ports outside the country rather than integrate different regions into a unified domestic economy. That pattern did not happen by accident. Its origins stretch back well over a century. In 1885, during the scramble for Africa, King Leopold II of Belgium secured international recognition over a vast territory that became known as the Congo Free State. Despite its name, it was not free. It became one of history's most infamous systems of colonial extraction. Rubber, ivory, and other resources flowed outward to international markets, while brutal forced labor systems generated immense profits for the colonial administration. Millions of Congolese suffered under policies that prioritized extraction above virtually everything else. International outrage eventually forced changes. In 1908, Belgium formally annexed the territory, creating the Belgian Congo. Some administrative reforms followed. Infrastructure expanded. Railways were constructed. Mining operations became increasingly sophisticated. But the central objective remained remarkably consistent. The colony existed primarily to export wealth. Roads connected mines to ports. Railways linked mineral deposits to foreign markets. Economic planning focused overwhelmingly on moving raw materials out of the country as efficiently as possible. Very little emphasis was placed on developing diversified domestic manufacturing capable of transforming those resources into finished industrial products. That distinction matters enormously. Imagine two countries with identical mineral deposits. One exports raw ore, the other refines it, manufactures industrial components, builds advanced products, and develops engineering expertise around the entire supply chain. Even if both begin with the same resource, they end with vastly different economies. One sells raw materials. The other captures far more of the value created afterward. Colonial Congo largely followed the first model. Its infrastructure reflected export priorities instead of balanced national development. Even decades after independence, many of those economic patterns proved remarkably difficult to reverse. Then came independence in 1960. The hopes were enormous. After decades of colonial rule, many believed the country could finally direct its extraordinary natural wealth toward national development. Instead, independence immediately collided with Cold War geopolitics. Within days, the mineral-rich province of Katanga declared its secession. This was no coincidence. Katanga contained some of the world's richest mining assets, making it strategically invaluable not only for Congo but also for international commercial interests. The political crisis quickly became an international one. Foreign governments, multinational corporations, and Cold War rivals all watched developments with intense interest. Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected prime minister, sought to preserve national unity while navigating pressure from multiple external powers. Within months, he was removed from power. In 1961, he was assassinated in circumstances that remained deeply tied to Cold War rivalries and competing international interests. The exact historical debates continue among scholars, but the broader lesson is difficult to ignore. Congo's domestic politics were never insulated from global strategic competition. Its mineral wealth ensured they rarely could be. Over the following decades, political instability, dictatorship under Mobutu Sese Seko, regional conflicts, debt crises, and fluctuating commodity prices all reshaped the country's trajectory. Yet beneath every political transformation, the minerals remained. Copper still mattered, gold still mattered. Industrial metals still attracted investment. The specific resource changed with each generation of technology, but the underlying pattern barely moved. Then, during the early 21st century, something remarkable happened. The world began electrifying. At first, lithium-ion batteries found their way into laptops and mobile phones. Then smartphones exploded into everyday life. Soon after came electric vehicles. Renewable energy systems required large-scale battery storage. Factories expanded production. Governments announced ambitious climate targets. Automakers committed hundreds of billions of dollars toward electrification. Almost overnight, minerals once discussed mainly within mining circles became strategic national priorities. Among them was cobalt. Although battery technologies continue evolving, and some manufacturers increasingly pursue lower cobalt or cobalt-free chemistries, many lithium-ion battery designs relied heavily on cobalt because it improved thermal stability, durability, and performance. As electric vehicle production accelerated during the 2010s, demand for reliable cobalt supplies increased dramatically. Mining companies expanded operations. Governments began identifying critical minerals as matters of economic security. Automakers signed long-term supply agreements. Investors poured money into battery supply chains. Suddenly, Congo's cobalt deposits were no longer merely valuable. They became strategically indispensable. Yet another contradiction emerged. Much of the mining occurred inside Congo, but much of the higher-value processing happened elsewhere. Raw or partially processed material frequently left the country before undergoing refining into battery-grade chemicals. From there, it entered increasingly sophisticated manufacturing networks capable of producing cathodes, battery cells, and eventually finished electric vehicles. Every additional industrial step created more jobs, more technology, more expertise, more economic value. Much of that value accumulated outside Congo. The country supplying the raw material often captured only a fraction of the total profits generated across the complete supply chain. And this brings us to another transformation, one that reshaped not only mining economics, but global geopolitics. Because once governments realized that critical minerals could determine the future of advanced manufacturing, competition stopped being solely about buying cobalt on international markets. It became about securing control over every stage of the supply chain itself. Ownership of mines mattered. Long-term contracts mattered. But perhaps even more important was something far less visible. Who controlled the refineries? Who mastered the chemical processing? Who built the battery factories? And who would ultimately dominate the industries of the 21st century? That realization would trigger a new global race, one where corporations and governments alike increasingly viewed Congo not simply as a supplier of minerals, but as one of the pivotal squares on an emerging geopolitical chessboard. The race for Congo's cobalt is often described as a contest over mines. In reality, the contest is much larger than that. Digging cobalt out of the ground is important, but the mine is only the first link in a chain that stretches across continents. After extraction comes concentration, refining, chemical processing, battery component manufacturing, cell production, vehicle assembly, and finally the finished products that reach consumers. Every stage adds value. Every stage creates skilled jobs. Every stage becomes another source of economic influence. That is why the 21st century competition over critical minerals is not simply about ownership of resources. It is about ownership of supply chains. Over the past 2 decades, Chinese companies invested heavily throughout Congo's mining sector. Some acquired existing projects. Others financed new developments. At the same time, China built enormous refining and processing capacity at home, allowing it to transform raw cobalt into battery-grade materials at a scale unmatched anywhere else. This distinction matters. A country that mines a resource does not necessarily control the industries that depend on it. A country that dominates refining and processing can exert enormous influence over global manufacturing, even if the minerals originate somewhere else. That realization has fundamentally changed how governments think about economic security. For decades, globalization encouraged countries to specialize. One nation produced raw materials, another manufactured components, another assembled finished products. The system emphasized efficiency. Today, many governments are asking a different question. What happens if one critical link in that chain becomes disrupted? The COVID-19 pandemic exposed vulnerabilities in global supply networks. Shipping delays halted factories. Semiconductor shortages slowed automobile production. Suddenly, policymakers recognized that efficiency alone was no longer enough. Resilience became just as important. The United States launched initiatives aimed at strengthening domestic battery industries and diversifying supplies of critical minerals. The European Union introduced its own critical mineral strategies to reduce dependence on concentrated supply chains. Japan, South Korea, and other industrial economies pursued similar policies. None of these efforts seek to eliminate Congo's importance. That would be nearly impossible in the short term. Instead, they aim to reduce strategic vulnerability by expanding mining elsewhere, investing in recycling, supporting alternative battery chemistries, and building more geographically diverse processing networks. Meanwhile, battery technology itself continues evolving. Some manufacturers increasingly use lithium iron phosphate batteries, which require no cobalt. Others continue using nickel-rich chemistries that still depend on significant amounts of cobalt because of their performance characteristics. Researchers work continuously to improve battery chemistry, reduce costs, increase safety, and lessen dependence on scarce materials. The future will likely involve several competing technologies rather than one universal solution. Yet even if cobalt demand changes over time, the broader lesson remains. Control over critical industrial inputs has become a central feature of geopolitical competition. The mineral may change, the strategic logic does not. But while governments debate industrial policy and multinational corporations negotiate billion-dollar investments, another question remains unresolved. What does all of this mean for the people living in Congo itself? This is where the conversation becomes most difficult. Economists often describe countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo through the idea of the resource curse. The phrase sounds almost mythical, as though natural wealth somehow carries supernatural consequences. In reality, it describes a collection of very real political and economic challenges. When one sector dominates exports, governments may become heavily dependent on commodity revenues while neglecting other industries. Commodity prices rise and fall unpredictably, making long-term planning difficult. Competition for control over valuable resources can intensify political struggles. Weak institutions may struggle to regulate enormous financial interests. Corruption can flourish where transparency is limited. None of these outcomes are inevitable. Countries like Norway, Botswana, and others demonstrate that natural resources can support broad development under strong institutions and effective governance. But success depends on how resource wealth is managed. That has been one of Congo's greatest challenges. Mining contributes enormously to export earnings, yet much of the country's population continues facing poverty, inadequate health care, limited educational opportunities, and insufficient infrastructure. Roads remain incomplete. Electricity access remains limited across many regions. Manufacturing capacity remains relatively small compared to the scale of the country's mineral wealth. This creates another paradox. The country supplying one of the world's most important industrial materials often captures only a fraction of the value created after that material leaves its borders. Imagine exporting crude oil while importing gasoline, or exporting timber while importing furniture, or exporting iron ore while importing steel. The pattern is similar. Raw materials generate revenue, but the largest economic gains often occur during refining, advanced manufacturing, engineering, research, and product design. Those higher value stages frequently take place elsewhere. This reality has fueled growing discussions inside Congo and internationally about local processing, greater industrialization, improved infrastructure, and increasing domestic participation across more of the supply chain. Such ambitions face significant obstacles. Building refineries requires reliable electricity. Manufacturing requires skilled labor, transportation networks, financing, legal certainty, and stable institutions. None of those can be created overnight. At the same time, ongoing insecurity in eastern Congo continues to complicate national development. Although the country's principal cobalt mines are concentrated in the southeast rather than the Kivu provinces, persistent conflict affects investor confidence, strains government resources, and reinforces perceptions of instability. Conflict in one region can influence economic opportunities far beyond the battlefield. That is why improving security, strengthening governance, and expanding economic opportunity are deeply interconnected goals. There are no simple solutions. Greater transparency in mineral sourcing can improve accountability. International certification systems can help companies better understand where minerals originate. Corporate due diligence can encourage more responsible sourcing practices. Foreign investment can create jobs and infrastructure when accompanied by effective regulation. Domestic reforms can strengthen institutions and improve public services, but none of these measures alone can erase more than a century of structural challenges. Nor can they eliminate the competing interests of governments, corporations, investors, neighboring states, and consumers who all benefit from access to critical minerals, because that is the final realization this story demands. The cobalt beneath Congolese soil does not belong only to the global battery industry. It connects millions of individual decisions. Every time someone purchases a new smartphone, every time an automaker announces another electric vehicle, every time a government introduces ambitious climate targets, every time investors finance another battery factory, those decisions send signals that travel backward through the global economy until they eventually reach minds thousands of miles away. The map we began with suddenly looks different. North and South Kivu are no longer just distant conflict zones occasionally mentioned in international headlines. Lualaba and Haut-Katanga are no longer simply names on a geological survey. Together, they form part of a strategic landscape that helps power electric vehicles driving through California, buses operating in Europe, renewable energy projects across Asia, and smartphones carried in nearly every country on Earth. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is not standing outside the modern global economy. It sits at one of its most important intersections. Its mineral wealth influences industrial policy. Its supply chains shape manufacturing strategies. Its stability matters to markets far beyond Africa. The world's transition toward cleaner energy is often presented as a technological revolution. But technology does not exist in isolation. Every battery begins somewhere. Every supply chain has an origin. Every clean energy ambition rests upon materials extracted from the earth by real workers inside real communities governed by real political systems. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson of Congo's cobalt. The future is not built only in laboratories, design studios, or assembly plants. It is also built in the places where the world's essential resources are found, and until the benefits of that future are shared more broadly with the countries that supply its foundations, one uncomfortable question will continue to shadow the global energy transition. Can the world truly call its future sustainable if the ground beneath that future remains so profoundly unequal?